Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to do Clair Obscur Expedition 33, the proposed minimum requirement, which is as follow: the i7-8700K or the Ryzen 5 1600X, 8GB of RAM, the GTX 1060 6GB variant, or the AMD Radeon RX 5600 XT, or the Intel Arc A380. You need the X12, 55GB of RAM, and SSD is required. The minimum spec allow for 1080p 30fps is low settings. Welcome to Respawn PC, I'm Dunk, let's game on. Let's start this. We are at the 1080p, lowest settings, and by default it enable TSR with the preset of low, mean we are at 50%. The dev didn't say anything about using the upscaling technology to be able to play at 30 FPS, but I'm going to leave it as default. Starting off with the i7-8700, I don't have the K variant, so it will be the 8700 straight, the GTX 1060 6GB variant, and for some reason I put the 16GB of RAM instead of 8. But you'll see in the testing how it went. This area is when you actually start the game, when you first play your character. So expect maybe a little bit difference when you reach further in game. But right now we get an average of 51 FPS with those settings. The GPU is pegged at 99% utilization, and we're using 5.4GB of VRAM out of 6. The CPU is in the mid 30% of utilization, so we don't have any bottleneck there. But the RAM, I put 16, but we've been able to use 8.2GB of RAM. I mean, you may encounter some bottleneck if you actually use only 8GB of RAM, and your FPS may drop to the close to the 30. We're going to test the memory issue in the real minimum requirement later next week or next week. Next up is the A380, a 6GB VRAM card. I kept the Intel system, the i7-8700, and I made sure resizable bar is enabled. And with the latest driver from Intel that include Expedition 33. We're still at 1080p at the lowest settings, but this game support XESS, so that's what we're going to use. At balance by default, we get an average of 48 FPS. The GPU is pegged at 99% of utilization, using 5.7GB of VRAM out of 6, that's perfect. CPU wise didn't change at all, and RAM we're using 8.3GB of RAM. So if you're only using 8, expect a lower FPS as you're going to have some RAM bottleneck. But like I said, we're going to figure out when I do the real minimum requirement. For frame time from graph, it's super smooth. The gameplay was perfectly fine. And I'm going to do all the other Arc GPU in a future video. So stay tuned if you want to see your Arc GPU. And finally, AMD side, we have the Ryzen 5 1600. I have the non-X variant, 16GB of RAM because I test all the other with 16, and the RX 5600 XT. I have the 8GB variant. They say the 6. I don't think they have a 6 variant, it's a 4 or 8. Anyway, I have the 8GB variant, and we're still at the 1080p lowest settings, and now we're back to TSR instead of XESS. The game doesn't seem to have FSR, but instead of a low balance or whatever, it was set at epic. So we actually native resolution with TSR, and it still gives us 47 FPS average. For this kind of game, it's perfectly fine, because if you play on Xbox, you're going to be at 30 FPS anyway, so you're better than the Xbox. And we're not even exactly pegged at the 99% utilization, we are at the 95% utilization, using 4.8GB of VRAM out of 8. CPU wise, we are in the i40s, and for the memory, we're using 9.2, so the 8GB of RAM, definitely not enough. And that's probably the reason they put that card in it, saying this is the minimum requirement, but the card was bottlenecked by the RAM. In conclusion, GPU wise it seems okay, CPU wise we have still enough power, memory wise 8GB seems to not be enough, that's why you're probably going to hit 30 FPS, even if the GPU can supply more FPS than 30 when you have 16GB. Also playing at native or without upscaling, you're getting even closer to your 30 FPS. So no upscaling and 8GB of RAM, you under 30 FPS. But stay tuned, you're going to see it in the real minimum requirement. Thanks for watching, see you in the next one, and subscribe.